Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Abiodun Oyewale of The Last Poets, and Alex Claffey, Kyle Poole, and David Bryant of the Alex Claffey Trio.
Happy Black History Month. That's such a joke to me. I think every day is Black History Month, right? I mean, black folks just didn't do all the wonderful things we did just the month of February. But I'm very happy to be here at the Schomburg, one of the only places of its kind. Are you happy to be here today? Well, I tell you what, these young men that I'm playing with, this is the very first time we've ever done this together. But I got a chance to sit and listen to these guys. They are out of, you're here. I'm not going to say nothing. You're here. They're bad. They're excellent. So we're going to try to rock it out and see if we can do something luscious and conscious at the same time. Okay. I always have to think about Leon Thomas when I do this because he was the one who made it famous. If you remember Leon Thomas and Pharoah Sanders, give him a hand, please. There was a time when peace was on the earth, and joy and happiness did reign, and each man knew his worth. In my heart, how I yearn for the Spirit's return, and I cry as time flies. There is a place where lovers often shine, and rainbows are reflections of a love that's so divine. And the glow of that love will light the sky up above, and it's free. Can't you see? Come with me. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. The Creator has a master plan, peace and happiness for every man. The Creator has a master plan, peace and happiness for every man. The Creator has a working plan, peace and happiness through all the land. The Creator makes but one demand, peace and happiness through all the land, all the land. My people, black, beige, yellow, brown, and beautiful, a garden of life with a love as sweet as scooping our wine, growing in muddy waters, making brown babies with pink feet and quick minds. My people warm, sometimes hot, always cool, always together. Together in church, in school, in jail, in the service of the streets throughout this forsaken land. My people, let's be together. Let's be together. Let's be together. Understand that we've lived together. Understand that we've died together. Understand, my brother, I've smelled your piss in my hallway and it smells just like mine. Understand that I love your woman, my sister, and her rare beauty is reason enough, for a revolution. A revolution. Yes, sister, my honest sister, I have ugly moments with you, but you are the only beauty I've ever known. Yes, sister, you are the joy in my smile, the reality of my dreams. You are the only sister I have, and I need you. I need you to feed the children of our race. I need you to feed the lover of our race. I need you to be the summer of my winters. I need you because you are the natural life in the living. At night, there's a moon to make the blackness be felt. I am that blackness, filling up the world with my soul, and the world knows me. And you are that moon, my moon goddess, my moon goddess. And I am your sun, and I shall take this piece of light and build the world for you, my sister. Sometimes the waters are rough, and the hungry tide swallows the shore, washing away all memories of children's footsteps playing in the sand. Where is the world I promised my son? Must he push back the tide and build the world I've talked about? Am I so godly until I forget what a man is? Am I so right until there's no room for patience? My brother, oh my brother, my brother, my brother, my brother, my brother, father of a son, my brother, father of a warrior, my brother, the son, my brother, the warrior. Be the beginning and the end for my sister. Be the revolution for our world. Turn yourself into yourself and then on to this disordered world and arrange a laughter for joy and the tears for sorrow. Turn purple pants, alligator shoes, leather jackets, brown boots, polka dot ties, silk suits. Turn mini skirts, false eyelashes, red wigs, blonde wigs, Easter bonnets, bell bottoms. Turn this confusion into unity. Unity. So that the sun will follow our footsteps in the day, so that the moon will glow in our living rooms at night, so that food, clothing, and shelter will be free, because we're born free to have the whole world as our playground. My people have the whole world as our playground. My people. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. The power of love, 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 the power of love. the power of love. Thank you. Give the brothers a hand. Bad.
Please join me in giving Abiodun Oyewoye a round of applause for that terrific performance. Also with the Claffy Stretch Trio from the New School. My name is Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I'm the director of the center. It's a delight to have you here this evening. I do recognize a few faces, but I see a lot of new ones. And for us, that's always a treat. It's an opportunity to share some of what we do, some of the terrific assets and resources that we have. We've been in the world of collection and preservation and interpretation of the global Black experience for almost 90 years. So we're very proud of that legacy, and as Abiodun of the Last Poets noted, the Schomburg is a very special and unique institution. And so to have a chance to share a little bit of that uniqueness and pride with you is a real joy and delight. We are also one of 4 research divisions of the New York Public Library, and so we are part of the largest public library system in the world, and therefore dedicated to free and open access, dedicated to inspiring others by the rich treasures that the past offers. Of course, we do more than just share our resources. We also inspire through our programming, so I want to invite you to grab one of our winter brochures on your way out, if you don't already have one. Some of you who are part of the Schomburg family certainly know of tonight's event because of that, but if you're here from the New School or here from Brooklyn or the Bronx or Queens or anywhere else in the metropolitan region, we invite you to come back, take a look at our winter brochure. There's a lot of terrific things happening. I also want to note that we have 2 exhibitions. Motown, The Truth is a Hit, just opened and will be here with us until July. We have a little bit of Detroit in Harlem. And so, Detroit's been in the news a lot for bankruptcy troubles and kind of a commentary on the post-industrial crisis in the United States. And so share a little bit of that amazing history. Enjoy it. It's part of the larger story of this country. We're grateful to have that show with us. Check it out. We also have Funky Turns 40, Black Character Revolution. This is a show that explores Black animated characters in programs such as Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids from the 1970s, Josie and the Pussycats, Black characters from Star Trek, the animated series, Jackson 5. Really terrific show. It includes the original animated, the original cells of the animation that came to life on your small screens. It's also the 40th anniversary of Funk. So if you hadn't noticed, this is an opportunity to engage. We have a couple of events I want to mention. One is tomorrow, the Malcolm X Museum's annual commemoration program on the occasion of the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, or El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. So that event, actually I don't have a time here. What time? 6:30. 6:30 tonight here at the Schomburg. So please, if you didn't know about it, now's an occasion to come out. This is an annual event, and we have another one in May. So stay tuned for details of that celebrating his birth. Also on Saturday, February 22nd, there will be a live taping of ESPN's Stephen A. Smith show at 10 a.m. As you know, that show is on 98.7, formerly KISS FM here in New York. And Stephen A. Smith has a lot of ideas about a lot of different things. So if you want to mix it up with him a little bit here at the Schomburg Center, you're certainly invited to come out for that. And it's actually, best I know, it's not an actual taping, it's a live. Yeah, they can't have live and taping, so it is a live broadcast of the show. I also want to thank, of course, the Schomburg Society members for their continued steadfast support of the Schomburg Center. We can't do so much of the free programming that we do without your support. If you're not a member, I invite you to do so. It matters to us, not only in the dollars and cents that contribute to our budget, but also being counted on our rolls helps us to know how meaningful our contributions to the cultural life of this community, as well as the city and this nation are. So please consider joining the Schomburg Center if you are not a member. You can find up-to-date information about all of our activities at schomburgcenter.org. You can live tweet tonight at #Schomburg. Our Twitter handle, as you can see, is at Schomburg Center. I encourage you, particularly because we have so many young people. And tonight's special hashtag is #RaceCrisis. Now, we are gathered here for a particular moment as part of a series, Voices of Crisis, the American Race Crisis Lectures. This exhibition and lecture series would not be possible without the following people: Miles Corman, the exhibition curator of the New School. Miles. I have to say that Miles is one of those creative, ambitious, makes things happen, big ideas kind of guys. I met him at the New School commencement ceremony where he was honored at the ceremony. I was fortunate to receive an honorary doctorate from the New School at the same event. And he talked to me about wanting to partner with the Schomburg Center. This has come to life. And so this is a terrific partnership. And for so many of you, I can tell, New School, shout out. If you're in the house in New School, good, right. So, this is the kind of university that you're involved with, and you should be proud of that. I want to mention Wendy Scher, the director of the University Archives and Special Collections. I want to thank Sam Biederman, director of communications, and particularly Dominque Howse, who has played a major part in the event design of the exhibition and also been a contributor to the creation of the program series itself. I want to especially thank my staff, Clarisse, Rosaz, Shariyf, and Ladi'Sasha Jones, who normally help in the midst of putting together a very busy program schedule all year long at the Schomburg Center, played an extra special part in making this particular series come to life. So I want to give them a special round of applause. And finally, to thank President David Van Zandt, who couldn't be here with us tonight. He opened the series last week with Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian and I discussing his experience and involvement in the civil rights movement. And of course, next week, we should mention, the final installment will take place at the New School on February 26th. At 6:30, we'll be in conversation with Harry Belafonte, Raquel Cepeda, and Philip Agnew of the Dream Defenders, looking at the movement from then to now. And so please join us for that. Finally, to say a couple of words about the exhibition itself. It explores the Race Crisis Lecture Series, which was held at the New School in 1964. In the spring of 1964, the first lecture was delivered by Dr. Martin Luther King on February 6th, I believe. The series welcomed speakers including Dr. King and many others. It featured, that's the exhibition notes, including the program, but the program series focuses these three public programs, of which this is the second part. I won't bore you with the details, I've already described them. Finally, the series and exhibition arose from research led by the New School student Chris Cruz, who rediscovered long-forgotten audio recordings of Dr. King, unscripted answers to audience questions that accompanied those formal lectures in the 1964 series. The Voices of Crisis exhibition will feature these original audio recordings and carry forward the legacy of the series. Okay. One final program note. Tonight, one of our guests, Les Payne, Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist, former editor and columnist at Newsday and founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, will not be able to join us due to illness. We will, of course, miss him, but my understanding is he has a very high fever, and as much as he wanted to make it out in spite of the symptoms of a cold, the fever kept him bedside. So we apologize in advance for those who came out wanting to hear Mr. Payne. He sends his regrets, and so do we. Okay. In 1964, following his controversial comments about President Kennedy's assassination, Malcolm X was disinvited from the American Race Crisis lecture series. This evening's program, Excluded, will feature Zaheer Ali, who will explore the role of Muslim leaders in the struggle for equality, the impact of Malcolm X's teachings, and the influence of the Muslim voice over the last 50 years. Zaheer Ali is currently a doctoral student in history at Columbia University, where he is focusing on 20th century African American history and religion. His dissertation examines the history of the Nation of Islam's Temple or Mosque number 7 here in Harlem from 1954 to 1965 during the time of Malcolm X's ministry. Ali served as senior advisor to Jennifer Maturana Taylor's New Muslim Cool, published in 2009, the first full-length documentary feature exploring indigenous American Muslim culture and its deep connections to hip-hop and the broader social justice movements today in African American and Latino communities. He is an alumnus of Harvard University, as well as a recipient of a Columbia University Merit Scholars Graduate Fellowship. Zaheer has written for TheRoot.com and is a member of the editorial advisory board of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. And now, please join me in welcoming Zaheer Ali to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. And I, too, am sorry that Les Payne couldn't join us. I will do my best to take up his part as well as mine. And so what we're going to have today is a conversation. It was supposed to be a conversation with Les Payne, but now it's going to be a conversation with this history. And with the purpose of kind of illustrating some trends that we may want to look around and see if they're still continuing. And so we'd like to start with a description of the American Race Crisis and the series, the original series, and where it came about. Because the exclusion of Malcolm X from the series is the exclusion of one person historically and specifically. But really, I think, illuminates the exclusion of a larger tradition that Malcolm represented. And so I want us to think about 4 things that happened to Malcolm and 4 things that happened to the tradition he represents, and 4 things that might be happening still today to voices that are like Malcolm. 1, there is a misreading, a complete misreading of Malcolm by some of his critics who don't really get the totality of who Malcolm is or was and his legacy. Number 2, there is a piecing apart of Malcolm's legacy into bits and pieces that people claim this piece but deny that piece, or they claim that piece and deny this piece, and they don't look at Malcolm in total context of who he was becoming at any given time period, and also the context of the larger time period that Malcolm was operating within, that he was responding to. So it's important to think about the context that Malcolm operated in. So after there's this misreading, after there's this piecing apart, there is a mischaracterization of Malcolm. And really within the Black freedom movement, there is a tendency amongst those who look at it superficially to think of good activists and bad activists, good politics and bad politics, responsible spokespersons and not irresponsible spokespersons. And lastly, once that labeling or mischaracterization is done, there is a marginalization of the voices that are deemed irresponsible, of the voices that are misread. And so all of these things happened to Malcolm specifically in this case, and I think illustrate what was happening to the tradition that he represents. So the series began, it was conceived of in 1963, and if you can see, there is a little timeline I put here so you can get a sense of what was going on, and because context is always important. And certainly we just finished last August observing the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington held on August 28th, 1963. And this was, at that point, considered by many a triumph of the movement. It certainly helped mobilize the nation toward the goal of passing meaningful civil rights legislation. And it was definitely something that was worth noting. Unfortunately, just a few weeks after that march took place, and I don't have this on the timeline, but it would have gone right here, in September was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 girls as they were attending Sunday school. And this, of course, was an act of terrorism that was not completely prosecuted in terms of everyone being brought to justice until well into the 2000s. So think about that. Like, the people who were responsible for this crime were not brought to justice until many decades later. So when people try to act like, oh, that was such a long time ago, it wasn't. And certainly the legacy of it wasn't. And so in this context, the New School conceived of this idea of having a series, and the description is, this is actually taken from their documents, that said, this lecture series will include social scientists, civic leaders, moderate to militant activists, and artists. It is envisioned as a contemplative review of the epic struggle for human dignity and equality of opportunity, which is now unfolding before our eyes. The teachers and the researchers, the artists and the activists will assess their roles and our future functions in the massive task of the unfinished business which lies before us. And they had, scheduled 15 speakers. The first was Dr. King, we'll hear from him in a second, and sent an invitation on October 18th to Malcolm X. He was scheduled to speak on March 5th. And this was a description given to him, or given about him, in terms of the original schedule for the program. Malcolm X is a spiritual leader of Muhammad's temple of Islam number 7, the most articulate spokesman of the religious and racial philosophy of the Black Muslims in America, will explain the goals and credo of the Nation of Islam, the religion founded by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in the United States. So this, of course, was Malcolm, was still in the nation. This is 1963. This is actually the height of Malcolm's speaking career. Malcolm was one of the most requested speakers on college campuses in 1963, second only to Barry Goldwater. So it was not unusual for Malcolm to receive these kinds of invitations. He was extremely popular, and if you've ever seen any clips of Malcolm speaking or heard Malcolm speak, and we'll hear from him in a little bit, you'll understand why everyone wanted to hear from Malcolm. So what happened to this invitation? Well, on November 22nd, 1963, the unthinkable happened when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And leading up to that, Malcolm had been organizing a large rally to take place in December in New York, where Elijah Muhammad was scheduled to deliver a major address. After the assassination of John Kennedy, however, Elijah Muhammad thought it was best not to speak, so he withdrew from the program. And the Muslims in New York who had organized this event, it was supposed to take place in what is now the Manhattan Center, they kind of pleaded with Elijah Muhammad and said, we've paid our deposit, we've put out all this promotional material, it would really hurt us if we cancel and don't, we can't get ticket sales and the like. And so Elijah Muhammad said, yes, you can go forward with the program, and issued this directive to all of his ministers, do not say anything about the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, why would he do that? The Nation of Islam was, they had been on record of calling white people devils. Like, why would they care about John F. Kennedy? Well, I think you kind of have to understand the Nation of Islam and how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as a nation, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about what that nationalist tradition means. But as a nation, they saw themselves as a sovereign, independent people respecting another nation, the United States, a sovereign, independent people. And therefore, the diplomatic thing to do is to either say nothing or offer condolences when the leader dies, okay? Whether or not it is considered genuine, it certainly would have been the diplomatic thing to do. So Malcolm went forward and gave the speech he gave. It was called God's Judgment of White America. He went through the whole speech. Everything was fine. And then he opened up for questions and answers. And a reporter asked him, the question was on people's mind. Malcolm was one of the most outspoken people in New York City, certainly. He had emerged as a very public and critical voice in Black America. What do you think about the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And Malcolm said, it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. The following day, the New York Times ran this story, Malcolm X scores U.S. and Kennedy, because what did Malcolm mean by that? Well, Malcolm said that the Kennedy administration, the United States government, had been responsible for sanctioning and fostering violence abroad, and that you could not be or should not be surprised when what you foster abroad would eventually come home. That is intellectually, historically, a correct statement. Was it appropriate is the question. And many people, just because right and appropriate aren't always the same things. And according to many in the press, many mainstream Americans, they thought Malcolm was making mockery of the president's death. They thought he was not expressing enough sympathy about the president's death. And so in light of this, not even a day passed after the New York Times article ran the story that some of the major supporters, either financial or founding figures of the new school, began writing the dean of the new school about this program. So Dorothy Hirshon, who was a philanthropist and a socialite, she had married one of the Hearst children of the Hearst publishing empire, so very well-heeled socialite in New York City, and I understand there's a conference room named after her at the new school, so clearly she gave some money to the new school. She said, and this is an excerpt from her letter to the dean, I can see no reason whatsoever for including Malcolm X, a man who has attempted to denigrate our late president and who preaches hatred and violence. Why not ask Governor Wallace? So we're going to deal with this question of hatred and violence, which is a misreading and mischaracterization of Malcolm, but this is what she said. Then another letter came from Alvin Johnson, who was one of the founders of the new school, right? So these are not people you would, if you were the dean of the school, you would take lightly. And he said, Malcolm X of the Black Muslims, a group that are worse than any communist group or any group of anti-integrationists. So they were both like, we just got the schedule. Why is Malcolm X on here? And the initial response of the dean in a letter that he wrote to the creator of the series, the faculty member, a man named Daniel Anthony, who had, a kind of a long-standing or his own career in terms of advocating human rights and race relations in Newark and in the New York area, the dean says to him, I continue to believe that the Black Muslim movement should and must be explored as a part of realizing the intent of this series. We will survive Malcolm X because of the intrinsic merit and scope of what the new school is trying to do through the American race crisis. So, the dean says, look, this is the mission of the series, was to explore all of these voices. It is important, that we include the Black Muslim movement, that we include Malcolm X's voice. Don't worry about it. I got this letter from Alvin Johnson. I heard from some other people. They're very upset, but we will go forward and we'll be fine. Well, something happened between December 3rd and December 5th. So I was talking to Miles, and I guess that there's a document missing, and this will probably be the document that says what happened, but we could make some inferences of what happened, because on December 5th, Malcolm X was disinvited. And the dean sent Malcolm a letter which included this passage: "In view of utterances made by you concerning the recent murder of the President of the United States and the actions taken by Elijah Muhammad regarding your conduct, we hereby withdraw and rescind this invitation. Your personal conduct has not been in keeping with the traditions and decencies honored at the new school. You are now not invited to speak at the new school during the spring semester 1964 or at any other time." So it's officially banned Malcolm from going to the new school. Now, it's interesting that this happened on December 5th, because on December 4th, Malcolm was suspended as a minister in the Nation of Islam and given a 90-day silence. So it was almost, whether or not they kind of sat back and waited to see what the response would be within Malcolm's organization, and this kind of gave them the sense that they could go ahead and say, well, you've been suspended anyway. You're not really representing the Muslims. You can't speak on their behalf. So, we're going to have to rescind our offer. But that doesn't really hold water, because March 5th, when he was scheduled to speak, would have been 90 days, right? So it's like Malcolm was still scheduled to speak after the 90-day suspension was over. This wasn't the first time Malcolm had been not banned or disinvited, that an attempted speaking engagement had fallen through. In 1961, in February, the students at Howard University, the student chapter of the NAACP, invited Malcolm to speak at their Black History Month event. And of course, the administrators at Howard, who were very much, staunch integrationists, felt that the presence of Malcolm would kind of give, Howard, put Howard in a complicated position, and did not allow the students to have Malcolm come speak at Howard in February of 1961. In October, E. Franklin Frazier, the scholar who wrote Black Bourgeoisie and was very critical of the Black middle class for its failings, what he felt were its failings, he was a faculty member at Howard. He invited Malcolm to speak at Howard. And the only way they could get Malcolm to speak at Howard is if they structured it as a debate, so that it wasn't, it wouldn't seem like they were giving Malcolm this kind of open platform. And so they had Baird Rustin come, and they debated. And it was a kind of debate where, if you paid attention to the ideas, maybe Baird Rustin won the debate on points. But if you paid attention to Malcolm's presentation and the audience response that Malcolm received, Malcolm won the audience. And so Malcolm was a very effective speaker, of course. So now we're going to, so Malcolm is banned from the series, he's banned from the new school, but Malcolm's shadow still looms large, because almost every speaker that came to this series was asked one or more questions about Malcolm X. So whether or not he could be there himself, his presence was certainly felt, or his presence was needed. So we're going to start with, we're going to go through, so we've picked out a couple of excerpts of different perspectives on Malcolm. One is Martin Luther King, who kind of is the, of course, spiritual, moral figure. The next is Milton Galamison, who is a community leader who gives a kind of political perspective. Then John Oliver Killens, and we'll see these people again. I just want to give you, so there's the spiritual guide, there's the political activist, there's John Oliver Killens, who's the cultural worker, there is Melvin Tooman, who is the academic, and then there's Louis Lomax, who's the journalist. So from these 5 perspectives, we're going to hear what they had to say about Malcolm at or during this series, and how that played into those 4 things: misreading, decontextualizing, mischaracterizing, and marginalizing, okay? So we're gonna start, so when the slide comes up, if the audio can play of Martin King addressing Malcolm's program.
Question is this one, which I think many of us have thought about in the past. Do you believe, Dr. King, that the black Muslim movement, or Muslim as it is called, I think correctly, can make a positive contribution to the civil rights movement?
I guess to answer this, one again has to determine what is meant by a positive contribution. If a positive can come through a negative, there may be some possible contribution that this movement can make. It may frighten some people enough to cause them to see that we better hurry up and get this problem solved. They think of me as a pretty bad fella down in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and say a lot of bad things about me. But even I've become a little more respectable when they discovered some of the ideals of the Muslim movement. But very seriously, it is known, I'm sure, I've made it very clear, that I disagree with the philosophy of this movement. If it is a philosophy that advocates a doctrine of black supremacy, I think this is wrong. I think black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy, and that we must never seek to rise from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thereby subverting justice, substituting one tyranny for another, but we must be concerned about democracy for everybody. If this movement advocates racial separation, which it does, then I would have to disagree, because I think our nation will come to its full maturity through racial integration, and I haven't come to the point of despairing. I believe this can be achieved, and I think there are many people working in many ways to make this a possibility, so that the despair that grows out of the philosophy that the problem can be solved within and that you must separate yourself in other states is something that I would not advocate at this time. But I do feel that this movement does remind the nation of something. And if, in reminding the nation of this something that it so desperately needs to hear and to know, there may be some contribution. It did not come into being out of thin air. It is symptomatic of the deeper unrest, discontent, and frustration of the Negro. And I think it is an indictment on the laxity of Christianity and the laxity of democracy that a movement like this came into being. And I think that the challenge of this movement is not so much to condemn its philosophy, as I will continue to do, but go out and work harder to get rid of the conditions that brought it into being.
So Dr. King here is offering a fairly, from his perspective, I think, a very principled stance in his thoughts on Malcolm. And the reason why I wanted to play that clip, of course, because it's Dr. King, and I always like to hear the original voices of people to give us a sense of how they said what they said. And a couple of things that struck me. So, of course, in the 20th century, probably if we think of American or Black American politics, the two figures that probably come to most people's minds is the iconic Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, symbolizing kind of the two political traditions, one of integration, one of nationalism in the Black freedom movement. And so it was important, I think, to put Martin King, not only because he was the first speaker, but he said a lot of things that we're going to come back to. But I do want to say a few things about MLK versus Malcolm X, and there are all these studies that look at what did they have in common, what were their differences, and they had very real principle differences, but they also had very real interesting commonalities. And the one that I want to focus on at this point in time is that they were both men of faith. And this is where I think the misreading of Malcolm takes place, that it is important that Malcolm is seen and understood for his political philosophy, but many of the people who talked about Malcolm, who still talk about Malcolm, who looked at the movement that he represented, whether it was, specifically the Nation of Islam or the broader kind of African-American Muslim tradition, saw in the advent of Islam in the African-American community not a religious yearning, not a faith yearning, but here what is framed a kind of political response or social response to racism. This is essentially what Mike Wallace called the hate that hate produced, right? This is the hate that hate produced thesis, that if you really want to change the movement, the produced hate, then you have to start with the original hate, right? And so I think it's important that we think about how Malcolm here is read as a secular political figure, when in fact one of his main driving motives and motivating factors was his religion, whether it was how he understood Islam while he was in the Nation of Islam or how he understood Islam after he left the Nation of Islam. Malcolm's, to give you an example, his Pan-Africanism was fostered in part and facilitated in part by his Muslim beliefs. In the 1950s, Malcolm was talking about the Bandung Conference, which was a conference of emerging African and Asian states, many of which were Muslim. When Malcolm held programs here in the mosque in Harlem in the late 50s and early 60s, he often invited members from Syria and Egypt, the UN delegations, to attend. So Malcolm always thought of himself as a Muslim within a broader Muslim, as we would say in the Arabic word, ummah, or Muslim community, while he was in the Nation of Islam. And in 1959, as a minister for Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm traveled to Africa and the Middle East. He didn't make the pilgrimage. He did go to Saudi Arabia. He also went to Sudan. He went to Egypt. And he made contacts as a Muslim that he would later make in 1964 when he made his more famous journey. And so it's important to think about how the religious life of Malcolm is kind of marginalized and read out of his story because he's seen in many respects as a kind of secular foil to Martin's Christian faithfulness. And I think a lot of that has to do with America not at that point, and maybe still not at this point, but hopefully better, not being able to come to terms with the religious pluralism that existed in the country. Okay, so that was Martin. The next speaker we want to hear from is Milton Galamison, who was a community activist, and he was the person who subbed in for Malcolm. He spoke at the series on March 5th, the day that Malcolm was supposed to speak. So if we can play that audio.
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell where the black Muslim movement is today because Cousin Malcolm hasn't been allowed to talk for a long time. And I don't know what the new spokesmen for the movement are saying. So I can't speak of it up to date, but I can say this, that the black Muslim movement, and those of you who heard me debate with Malcolm X back in last March on Channel 13, was causing me quite some concern, even though the debate did lose me a lot of friends. It caused me concern because the black Muslim movement was immobilizing the Negro struggle in the North. Now, why do I say that? I say because in the South, the Negroes are in motion and they know what they want. They want integration. But when you got a guy standing around on the street corners talking about going back to Africa and setting up separate states when he apparently doesn't intend to do either, so that Negroes just work up a frustration and Negroes do not press for their fair share of American life, you have a real problem on your hands. And this is what happened. Back in August, I didn't know whether we'd get a school boycott together or not to press for integration because I wasn't sure we had that many Negroes who were interested in it. Now, I think the black Muslim movement has been wonderful in terms of some of the people it has redeemed from lesser pursuits. I think it's been wonderful in its indictment of the white people of this country because much of what they say about the white people is true.
Okay, so I thought it was interesting because on the one hand, he's very critical of the political program of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, but saying what they say about white people is true. I was like, wow, that's kind of out there. I want you to look at the timeline, though. This is only a few days before Malcolm officially leaves the Nation of Islam, right? So one of the things as I was looking over these materials, I thought of, we really all should be careful when we act off of immediacy, right? When we speak of the moment. And we always do that. We pass judgments on people all the time, like of what they just did. Like, I can't believe what she just said, or I can't believe what he just did. And sometimes you do have to step back and think about how this fits into a broader thing. And unfortunately, some of these speakers weren't. So but I want to tackle some of the things that Galamson. Interesting thing about Galamson, a week later, so Malcolm had left the NOI. A week later, Galamson was meeting with Malcolm to help organize protests against schools in New York City. And interesting, Galamson subbed in for Malcolm at the new school on the day that Malcolm was killed, on February 21st. Galamson was scheduled to speak, but he didn't show up. Just, kind of weird historical coincidences. But let me get at this thing about nationalism. First of all, neither Malcolm nor the Nation of Islam were talking about going back to Africa, right? This is a caricature of nationalism, a caricature of Pan-Africanism. Even Garvey wasn't saying go back to Africa. It was a cultural reorientation toward Africa and African culture, right? So this is a really kind of gross caricature and dismissal of nationalism. But the other thing is this call for separate states. Now, if you were to look at the Muslim program, it was called the Muslim program, what the Muslims want, what the Muslims believe. It was printed on the back of every Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And if you look today, if you were to stop on 125th Street, get a brother selling the Final Call, you'd see the same Muslim program printed on the back of that paper. The section that talks about separation, all of those passages begin with if. If we cannot get justice in this land, if we cannot get equality, it's conditional, right? It's saying, now, many of the people who are in those movements believe that it's not possible to get justice and equality, but the fact is it's conditional. It was never some kind of wild-eyed, scheme to get separate states. Now, practically, there were states identified. Like, if you were going to give us states, we have identified which ones we want. The ones with the fertile land, right? I mean, let's be real. But, this nationalism, territorial nationalism, was designed, I'm arguing, to provide an alternative geography, an alternative map, so to speak, for Black people in America. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, okay, so while people were like laughing at Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm talking about they wanted they called it the Black Belt, like Alabama and Mississippi, and where the real rich soil is, while they were like, that's so crazy, he wants that land in the South, that's never gonna happen. The Nation of Islam, under Elijah Muhammad's leadership, and Malcolm as his spokesperson, were quietly buying properties within cities around the United States, right? Almost, major properties in the south side of Chicago, properties here in Manhattan. There was a burgeoning Muslim neighborhood in East Elmhurst, Queens, around the house that there were a bunch of Muslims living there. They had businesses in Corona, in Brooklyn. And the point when the Muslims talked about Chicago, when Malcolm said Washington, D.C., or Philadelphia, or Boston, they weren't talking about Chicago, Illinois, the United States of America. They weren't talking about Washington, D.C., the United States of America. They were talking about Chicago, Temple number 2 in the Nation of Islam. Washington, D.C., Temple number 4 in the Nation of Islam. Boston, Massachusetts, Temple number 11 in the Nation of Islam. And so this was an alternative. Think of like drawing a map, a different map that you overlay on the United States. This is essentially taking over the country by creating a parallel structure, right? And so when we think about nationalism, it isn't about necessarily contiguous territories. It is about appropriating for yourself the space that you occupy, right? Long before there was an Occupy movement, the NOI and Malcolm were occupying, okay? So it's important to think about nationalism in that context of providing alternative national identity, alternative national geographies, even the routes that they traveled, right? So they had a luncheonette, a restaurant on like 122nd and Lenox, but the mosque was at 116th and Lenox. And so on Sundays and Wednesdays, after every meeting, you would see a stream of Muslims walking up Lenox Avenue to 122nd Street. The act of walking is like possessing the street. Right? And so, you know, there's that famous police protest that Malcolm organized when one of the brothers was beaten in 1957, where, you know, hundreds of FOI lined up in formation outside the police precinct. That is an act of owning your community, right? And that's the kind of nationalism that practically the NOI did. Even if ideologically they spoke to this kind of broader, kind of, we would say, dreamy kind of nationalism, the nuts and bolts of owning a community was being done. And so I don't think, I mean, I think I would, of course, take issue with Galamison's dismissal, but let's move on to someone who did take Malcolm seriously, and this was John Oliver Killens, and I don't think we have audio for him, but John Oliver Killens, for those who don't know, he was one of the leaders of the Harlem Writers Guild. He was a, you know, well-established cultural worker. He met Malcolm several times after this time. He's speaking on March 12th. So this is right after Malcolm has announced his decision to leave the Nation of Islam. Things are moving so fast for Malcolm at this point. I mean, even though he says in this press conference he gave on March 8th, you know, that I'm leaving the Nation of Islam, he's still expressing, at least publicly, fidelity to the program of Elijah Muhammad, right? So the kind of ideological shift is not entirely clear yet for many people who are observing Malcolm. But here's what John Oliver Killens says when he's asked about you know, what can Malcolm contribute to this discussion, to the race crisis in America? He says, I think that Malcolm's vitality, his audacity, his display of manhood. You see, Negroes are kind of tired and done with the great white father image in terms of the assertion of manhood. He was challenging the establishment. Malcolm has the facility, like in the tradition of the old Baptist preacher in the South, who at the big meetings, they would fight the devil. There is room for Malcolm. Malcolm has a contribution to make, just like the rest of the Negro leaders in this country. And so Killens says very clearly, there's a room for Malcolm, there's a room for James Farmer, there's a room for Roy Wilkins, there's a room for everyone. And he comes closest to appreciating the need for a kind of pluralistic approach to the race crisis in the United States. Okay, so we have a couple of more speakers to hear from, and then we'll hear from Malcolm himself. The next speaker is Melvin Tooman, who is an academic, and we do have audio for him, so let's hear what he has to say.
Our speaker last week, Mr. John O. Killens, stated that he felt that Malcolm X had something to contribute to the movement in that he embodied the manhood for which the Negro was striving. Do you feel that Malcolm X has a contribution to make in the movement for equality?
Yeah, I think the general contribution of Malcolm X is to demonstrate how dreadful the relation between Negro and whites can get if responsible elements in both communities don't move much more rapidly toward an effective compromise. He represents, I think, politically speaking, the most undesirable possible manifestation of political dissent in this society, both from the point of view of the welfare of Negroes and the welfare of whites, and the welfare of the total community. He does not represent manhood, it seems to me. He represents a native form of an old throwback to Garveyism, which was a fatal error for the Negro community when it first occurred.
Man, why do you have to be an academic? Like, you know, it's like, he's giving academics a bad name. Clearly, I think this is a load, his course, and it's funny at the end of his, this answer, he says, I know people want to jump on me for saying what I just said, and that's fine, jump on me. And Tooman, he was like, I think he was a professor at Princeton at the time. He had done a lot of work on race relations, sociologist, anthropologist. But what I wanted to highlight was this word responsible, right? And it ties into Martin King's statement about respectable, and talk about the politics of respectability. and how the politics of respectability is used to marginalize certain voices and people from our spaces and from our conversations and from our discussions, so that Malcolm was not seen as a responsible person. His politics was not seen as respectable. And certainly in the characterization of the Black freedom movement, the old way of describing the Black freedom movement is the Christian, good, moral, Southern, integrationist, nonviolent struggle in the South, and the Northern, secular, bad, violent, Black power, riotous demonstrations in the North, right? And that kind of dichotomy is reflected in this kind of declaring certain kinds of voices responsible and respectable. You know, and Malcolm's response, and certainly my response was, you know, you don't have really, or you should step lightly when you're trying to tell aggrieved people how to grieve. You know, I was watching Jordan Davis's Parents this weekend, and I mean, you know, I can't imagine what it's like to lose a child. I can't imagine what it's like to lose a parent, right? Much less a child. And so I was talking to some friends, and you know, if you guys haven't seen her statement or their statements, you should see. It's on YouTube. And they basically, I think she said, she's like, I'm going to pray for Michael Dunn. And I was like, I wouldn't pray for him. Like, you know, but that has a tradition. Right? There's a long tradition of where that's very real, coming from, you know, people who express their grief in that way and a kind of redemptive suffering. But there's also a tradition of expectations where Black people almost don't have the privilege to express rage, aren't allowed to express anger, because when you do express anger, you're irresponsible, you're the, what did he call it? You're the most undesirable possible manifestation of political dissent in this society. And I think we have to call that into question and be aware that we don't marginalize voices of people who express their dissent in ways that we don't consider, you know, of polite society. I think it's really important for us to learn from this lesson of Malcolm's exclusion from this important discourse, you know, because of that kind of politics. Okay, final speaker from this series was Lomax, who was a journalist. Lomax was actually the person who interviewed Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad for the Hate That Hate produced documentary that did like the first sensationalized expose of the Nation of Islam in 1959. It so scared the bejesus, literally, out of Black and white people, like, you know, who saw this. The network aired it again. And so Louis Lomax actually worked with Malcolm to help establish the Muhammad Speaks newspaper in New York City before the paper was moved to Chicago. So Lomax knew Malcolm, you know, pretty well. But here's what he had to say when he was asked about the kind of lasting legacy of Malcolm. So now Lomax is giving his answer on April 9th, which is after Malcolm's famous The Ballad of the Bullet speech, right? So I feel like Lomax should have known better, but let's hear what he has to say.
Where do you think Malcolm X is going since his separation from Elijah Muhammad, and what is the effect of this split upon the movement of Black Muslims?
Take the questions in reverse order. I think the Black Muslim movement will become just another cult like Father Divine, Bishop Grace. It will fade from the scene and little be heard of anymore. Malcolm X was about all they had in terms of a public, articulate voice. Where Malcolm goes is another question. My own feeling is he isn't going very much of anywhere. I think he'll do a lot of lecturing around the country. A lot of people want to hear him. But in terms of getting a following and an organization going and a movement going, I have deep doubts that he can do it. I think his only hope is that somehow he can persuade some civil rights organization already established, I don't know who will do it, to let him come in and ally with them, and this would give him a platform. But at the moment, Malcolm is a general in search of troops, and I don't think he's going to find very many.
So this is when you like, history is so humbling. And you really, when I talked about the beware of immediacy, right? Or you're just saying statements of the time. Because all of this, of course, none of this proved to happen, right? Not only did the Nation of Islam continue to grow, by the time of Elijah Muhammad's passing in 1975, there were upwards of, depending on what the estimates were, like 800,000 to 1 million members of the Nation of Islam, which had amassed like $80 million in property, right? That is not a movement that has gone the way of Father Divine and Bishop Grace, right? And of course, Malcolm, we know that his life was cut short, so he wasn't able to build an organization. But Malcolm's troops were everywhere, right? Like the Black Panther Party were children of Malcolm. The Black Arts Movement was children of Malcolm. Amir Baraka, who just passed, rest his soul, was a child of Malcolm, right? Malcolm certainly had troops after this point in his life. So this is important as we think about the legacy of Malcolm, and I wanted to close by playing some of Malcolm to give us a sense of what they missed out on at the new school, right? By banning Malcolm from their school and not letting him speak at the series, because this period of Malcolm's time was really dynamic. I mean, so much was happening in Malcolm's life, and he was also thinking, you know, just like constantly revising his ideas. Even before he left the nation, on November 10th, 1963, he gave his famous message to the grassroots, right? This is a speech where Malcolm talks about the difference between a black revolution and a Negro revolution, right? This is a speech where Malcolm gives the famous formulation of the house Negro versus the field Negro, right? You should definitely check out that speech. So, you know, I kind of bookended Message to the Grassroots with Ballad of the Bullet, because the Ballad of the Bullet revisits some of those ideas about revolution, and many people, to come back to Dorothy Hirshon's point of violence, you know, Malcolm never preached violence, he preached self-defense, right? He never preached the initiation or aggressive violence. He preached that people had the right to stand their ground, right? So I'm gonna play a couple of clips from the Ballad or the Bullet, and many people think when Malcolm talked about the Ballad or the Bullet, he was talking about, you know, we're gonna shoot you. And no, Malcolm was saying, use your ballot like you would use a bullet. When you use a bullet, you make sure you have your target in sight, you know what you're going after, right? You don't waste your bullets, you don't waste your ballots, right? This is what he was talking about. He wasn't saying like, give me the vote or give me a gun. He was saying, use your vote with the same kind of precision and strategic thinking that you would use a gun. Okay, so we can play the first clip. The first clip, kind of the first like bullet point comes from that, so we can play the first clip.
Victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close, they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any block, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who'll go to the White House and who'll stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep...
Okay. I was like, is that 1964 or 2008, right? And, you know, so, of course, whether or not we recognize our ballots function with this kind of power, certainly the wave of voter disfranchisement laws being passed throughout the country are signs that other people recognize the power of the vote. And so Malcolm was clearly advocating not just voting, but voting intelligently, strategically, and understanding that you have the power, if you vote as a bloc, to sway elections. This was how Kennedy got elected. Right? Kennedy was elected because in the majority of the precincts that had strong black electorate turnout are the ones that swung the electorate in his way. Okay, the second clip, what I thought was important because in the message to the grassroots, this is a little bit different from Malcolm. In the message to the grassroots, Malcolm makes a distinction between the Negro Revolution and the Black Revolution. He says, the Negro Revolution is a nonviolent revolution, right? Like, you're begging, that's like a begolution, right? He was critiquing the March on Washington. He called it the farce on Washington. It was co-opted. It was taken over by the administration, which it was, if you don't know that story. But they didn't tell you that story last year when they were commemorating it. But Malcolm was critical of the civil rights movement, and he, in saying what was a Black revolution, was a revolution that involved loss of life, right? But by the time he's giving the Battle of the Bullet, he's kind of refining his ideas on what revolution is. So if you can play that clip.
It's liberty or it's death. It's freedom for everybody or freedom for nobody. America today finds herself in a unique situation. Historically, revolutions are bloody. Oh yes, they are. They haven't never had a bloodless revolution or a nonviolent revolution. That don't happen even in Hollywood. You don't have a revolution in which you love your enemy. And you don't have a revolution in which you are begging the system of exploitation to integrate you into it. Revolutions overturn systems. Revolutions destroy systems. A revolution is bloody. But America is in a unique position. She's the only country in history in a position actually to become involved in a bloodless revolution. The Russian Revolution was bloody. Chinese Revolution was bloody. French Revolution was bloody. Cuban Revolution was bloody. And there was nothing more bloody than the American Revolution. But today, this country can become involved in a revolution that won't take bloodshed. All she's got to do is give the black man in this country everything he's doing. Everything.
Okay, so this is a very clear distillation by Malcolm of what constitutes revolution in a way that I think was not so clear in Message to the Grassroots. And had he been invited to participate in the American Race Crisis series, Malcolm would have reflected this kind of, they would have had Malcolm at like one of the most pregnant times in his life, right, in terms of the kinds of ideas that he was thinking about. I had a couple of other excerpts. I don't have the sound for it, but I thought it was important. In the Battle of the Bullet, Malcolm says, now in speaking like this, it doesn't mean that we're anti-whitey, but it does mean we're anti-exploitation, we're anti-degradation, we're anti-oppression, and if the white man doesn't want us to be anti-him, let him stop oppressing and exploiting and degrading us. And in this, Malcolm is moving from a racialized discussion of oppression to looking at the specific actions that constitute oppression. I thought that that was an important shift. And two more things. He says we need to expand the civil rights struggle to a higher level, to the level of human rights. He goes on to say, you don't take the criminal to his own court and expect justice. Kind of like what happened in Florida twice. And what Malcolm was saying was, many people know this, he was advocating for the United Nations to take up the case of the condition and situation of black people in America. And again, this has to do with that expanded geography, right? To not see yourself confined by the national boundaries of the nation state of the United States, but that your citizenship transcended that. Right? And so I think that that was important. And then finally, he said, we'll vote with you on the voter registration job, we'll work with you on rent strikes, we'll work with you on the school boycotts. Galamison was one of those people. Malcolm said, I don't believe in integration, but I don't support segregation. Right? And so it's important to understand the distinction between segregation and separation. Segregation is done to you. Separation is what you do by yourself, right? And so the key to understanding the nationalism that Malcolm advocated, the tradition that Malcolm advocated, was the desire for autonomy and self-determination, right? Whether you are sitting among people from different racial and ethnic groups or sitting by yourself, the goal was always for these people in this tradition was to gain autonomy and self-determination. And so I think, hopefully that gives us a richer sense of what Malcolm was articulating at this point in time, right? And it's really important for us to move away, that we try to read Malcolm more completely, that we try to contextualize Malcolm more completely, that we characterize Malcolm more accurately, and that we recenter the narrative about some people like Malcolm so he isn't marginalized. So we don't have school teachers trying to tell fourth graders that they can't write their papers about Malcolm X because he was bad and violent, right? So we don't have talented but misguided rap artists putting Malcolm's images on single covers for their artwork for very offensive music, right? That is misreading Malcolm. That is decontextualizing Malcolm. That is mischaracterizing Malcolm. That is marginalizing not just Malcolm, but the movement that he represented. Thank you.
Can you all help me give another round of applause to our wonderful lecturer, Zahir Ali? We will now take about 4 or 5 questions here at the mic. If you have questions for Zahir to answer, we'll take just about 4 or 5, okay?
Yes, my question is about where do we go from here? It's been almost 50 years. And what I'm going to suggest is that although we always talk about white supremacy and racism and all of that, but the fundamental problem that facing America and the world is genocide. I didn't say genocide, genocide. The false belief that the brotherhood is superior and the sisterhood are inferior, that drive the chaos, the insanity, the policy, the unequal pay, all of these things. So maybe the new school needs to take a deep breath and do a forum on genocide in this day and era.
I don't have anything to dispute that. I mean, I think, absolutely. I think, one of the ideas that has kind of regained its currency is the idea of intersectionality, which was a thought or a kind of concept put forward by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, which looked at the intersection of identities and how that affects the experiences of people. And she used the intersectionality. She used that. It was like if you are at the intersection in a car accident, that accident might be caused by cars coming from one direction, it might be caused by cars coming from another direction, or cars coming from all directions, right? Each direction being a different kind of discrimination. And certainly, we have to see how acts of discrimination are linked, not just race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, right? So there's a more complex kind of construct that we have to attack, certainly.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really learned a lot tonight. It was really, really brilliant, and I loved hearing those audio recordings and those voices. It was very rich. And I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about how, obviously hearing these different political leaders speaking about you and probably saying one thing out in public and maybe feeling another thing in private. Do we have a sense of how Malcolm felt about all of these different entities sort of speaking about him, either excluding him or integrating him? You were talking about this was a time where he was really flourishing, but in his own sort of interpersonal sort of scheme of things, was he really, how did he feel about all these different voices sort of attacking or having their opinions or whatnot about him?
Well, I think that the early Malcolm thrived off of it, right? Like when he was disinvited from Howard University, he's like wrote a letter to Elijah Muhammad and was like, we threw a rock in that, now they're all fighting among themselves. So I think he kind of thrived off of it. But later on, I think he moderated and modulated his speech accordingly. So that reflects a kind of sense on his part that there was, I don't know, I wouldn't say regret, but the need to kind of move forward. He went down south where he didn't meet Mark, but he met Coretta, and he said, let your husband know that I support him, and I'm happy to be the foil. Right, I'm happy to be the boogeyman to his angel, right? So that people know if they don't deal with him, I'm here, right? So he was willing to engage, and like I said, and of course he went in '64 in April when they were debating the Civil Rights Act in Congress. He went to observe the debate, and King was there, and that's where they took that famous picture, right? You've seen that famous picture of Martin and Malcolm shaking hands. It was at the Capitol building. Like I said, he met with Galamison after Galamison kind of trashed him a little bit, or mischaracterized him. He had known Lewis. He knew all these people, and even some of the white journalists said, Malcolm's disagreements were on program, on policy, on politics. They were never personal. So when people met Malcolm in person, he was like gentle, he was kind, he laughed, he smiled. And I think that that's something for us to keep in mind, that you can disagree without being disagreeable.
How you doing? I have a serious question. Like, I grew up in Harlem, and at a time I remember when African Americans had control of their economic destiny in our communities. Today, every block got an Arab store. We don't own any of the economics in our communities. Could you just speak on how that intertwines what Malcolm's vision was and how we can better ourselves today to be able to own stuff? Thank you.
Yeah, well, Malcolm's, the nationalism that Malcolm advocated was for black-owned businesses, and certainly, there are people who are still advocating that, and I think, whether it is, there have been waves of immigrant enterprising, entrepreneurial immigrants who've come to the United States. And Arabs may be the latest wave. Before then, there were Eastern Europeans, there were, Jews, there were others who are immigrants. And so, part of this is understanding how the United States' racialized project works, right? That once people arrive on America's shores, there is a group that is easily already identified as the other against which they define themselves, right? So James Baldwin called it the price of the ticket, right? The price of becoming American means buying into this kind of racial project. And so, people, they are enterprising people who want to, like everyone else, do good for themselves, right? But the question is, and the challenge that Malcolm posed to the community was to overcome some of the kind of cultural barriers and long-time institutional barriers, right? It's not just that black people don't want to form their own businesses, it's that you have hundreds of years of accumulated disadvantage in terms of real capital, right? Of disinherited wealth, right? From slavery, from Jim Crow, from even the black farmers who have, who are only just being compensated. You have redlining of districts where banks would either give, high interest loans. All of these things are policies that have restricted and limited the abilities of African Americans to actually own businesses. So I think all of those things have to be addressed.
I also want to thank you very much, everyone who organizes. I think this is a discussion that has to continue. But I would hope that maybe you could elaborate a little bit more, because I think it's very important. I'm looking at the audience and the age. Most of the people in here are not as old as I am. And there was in the 60s and the 70s, there was a revolutionary temper throughout the entire world. And Malcolm and everybody else has we look in the context of that. The issue of self-determination was the guiding issue for all the black nations in Africa, for the people that were fighting for freedom around the world. So self-determination was not just some concept that he had in his head, and it's part of the UN Charter in terms of one of the human rights. So if you could just elaborate, because people need to not just look at individuals, but look at the movements that were around them. And finally, the issue of the thing around the ballot, he was talking about accountability. You can go to the ballot and vote for somebody, But how do you hold them accountable once they get in? So this idea of just running to vote for somebody, and plus, you should be generating the people who are gonna run. You should be saying, I'm sending you to vote on this agenda, and if you don't stay to that, we're gonna take your butt out. So we need to look at the kind, it wasn't just going and voting. He was talking about building a movement that could hold accountability and fight for human rights in all aspects, and self-determination was critical. It's not a crazy, bizarre thing for people to fight for their nation. They do it all around the world, so why would it be crazy here?
Absolutely. All I can say is she made it plain. I don't have anything to add to that.
I wanted to ask you, if my host was a Trayvon Martin, what would he say? And I want to ask you, what would my host say about a Zimmerman verdict if he was alive today?
What would Malcolm say about the verdict?
Yeah, and I also want to get killed by Zimmerman.
So I always am hesitant to do what I call historical ventriloquism. You know, what would a historical figure say? No, but it's a kind of like, what would Malcolm, like, what would WWMD? What would Malcolm do? What would Malcolm say? So I don't want to speak for Malcolm, but I think that Malcolm's words and his history would be enough for us to think about. And I think the question is, what do we say, right? Like, we have to take on the responsibility of carrying on the legacy and not put the voice or the responsibility to speak out on a historical figure of the past. We have the history of Malcolm. Malcolm would, of course, look at this. I mean, I saw this and I said, you know, Malcolm would say it's time to have a national conversation on black self-defense. Because, you know, that is, you know, people say that's irresponsible, that's, you know, that's not respectable, but maybe if we started sounding a little more than suffering victims, that people would think twice before they killed our children. Right? Maybe. I don't know how it works, right? I'm not advocating, Malcolm advocated forming rifle clubs, right? But maybe, you know, like, because people say like, oh, well, now all people need to know is that your child might be carrying a gun. That's even more reason for them to shoot you. Well, they didn't need a reason before, right? So, but I do think we need to have a conversation about what we can do, not only to, you know, address the stand your ground laws around the country, not only to make sure, to the sister that said, you know, voting, you know, part of the importance of registering to vote is to get on jury rolls, right? Because you get called for jury duty off of voter registration. And so, you know, thank God there were, we are assuming, I don't know if the black jurors voted, but the 2 jurors that voted in the Jordan Davis trial, thank God they stood their ground and it ended in mistrial and not an outright acquittal, right? So, you know, these are the types of things that we have to do, but then we also have to think about what we can do to keep our families and communities safe. That goes beyond the kind of politics of respectability of, you know, make sure my child acts a certain way and speaks in a certain way and dresses in a certain way. I mean, you know, that's like immediate survival maybe, but we have to have something better to offer. And I don't know what that is, but I do think we need to have a national conversation on self-defense. Thank you for all of you for your questions and for coming out tonight. Is that it?
Let's thank Zahir Ali again for a terrific lecture. I'm very, very, very pleased that he mentioned the incident in Queens where the teacher said that that a student couldn't write about Malcolm X because he was a bad person. I think that couldn't be a more clear explanation of the crisis of historical illiteracy in our country, about what we don't teach in our classrooms, and about the political stakes of history and knowledge. What we learn what we remember are all part of the political struggle, the cultural work that we do every day. And so thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for being part of that work. Spread the word, continue to come back. We'll see you here tomorrow evening for the annual commemoration sponsored by the Malcolm X Museum. We'll see you next Wednesday at the New School for the final installment of the American Race Crisis series. Have a good evening.